So this is based on a recent paper. So it's joint work with my co-authors Julian Wright and Ted Houtain at National University of Singapore. And we're interested in a topic that I guess is on everyone's minds, both policymakers, but also a lot of researchers recently. And the question is whether platforms should be allowed to sell on their own marketplaces. In other words, to vertically integrate into the products supplied by third parties on their marketplaces. So this is, I think it's useful to point out that this is an increasingly widespread phenomenon. So there are many e-commerce players that act both as marketplaces, so providing a marketplace for third-party sellers, and as sellers themselves on those marketplaces. I think everyone immediately thinks of Amazon, but there's actually lots of other examples. So there are many e-commerce players around the world that look like Amazon, so something very similar, so including Target and Walmart in the US, JD.com in China, Flipkart in India, and so on. But it's also broader than this, right? I mean, a lot of platforms, even say Apple and Google with iOS and the Play Store. I mean, yeah, they provide the platform, but they also provide some of the applications on those platforms. And again, lots of software companies do this. I mean, they start off with their own software and then they open up marketplaces for third-party sellers, which means they inevitably find themselves competing with the participants on those marketplaces. And in fact, this practice has gotten so popular that there is now at least one very large firm, so it's a startup, but I guess a late-stage startup in France called Miracle, which actually helps retailers create marketplaces around their own offerings. In other words, basically becoming a combination of a marketplace and reseller. So the question, the interesting question here for everyone is whether platforms should be allowed to play this dual role of providing both the marketplace and being active sellers on that marketplace. There's lots of, I mean, I think everyone's aware of this. There's lots of policy interest around the world. So policymakers in different jurisdictions have taken a keen interest in this. So in India, as far as I know, is the only country up to date. Let me pause for a second. I think maybe someone forgot to unmute themselves. Okay, I think it should be fine. So as far as I know, India is the only country up to date that has actually implemented legislation explicitly forbidding, so in their case, it's Flipkart and Amazon, from playing this dual role. So they basically force them to choose one or the other, either pure marketplace or pure reseller. In the US, there's been a lot of talk, and I think there's, I forgot to include in this slide, there's, I forget what the name of it, there's a piece of proposed legislation that targets specifically this issue, that actually proposes to say we either break up companies like Amazon or we tell them you have to choose either your marketplace or reseller. So in the paper, I mean, I will not show you the model, but this is exactly the question that we study in the paper. So what I want to do here is just to talk at a high level of the economic considerations involved in this policy question. So at a high level, I mean, the first thing to note is that allowing large firms to operate in this dual mode, so reseller and marketplace, across many different product categories, it should be pretty obvious that it's efficient. It could be efficient and pro-competitive. And the reason is the following. Having a market, for some products, the third parties might be better, might be either more innovative or have lower costs than the platform provider. And for other products, the platform might be in a better position, either high quality or lower cost than the third parties. So it stands to reason that it is efficient to allow the market, so the platform to provide some product and the third parties to focus on other products. And then the marketplace provides a one-stop shop for everyone to offer those. So banning the dual mode across multiple product categories, to me, is very clear, that does not make a lot of sense, and it's a clear non-starter. Now, we can still ask the question, should we allow platforms to function in dual mode at the level of an individual product or product category? Of course, then there's the question, how do you define a product or a product category? But I think at the very least, we should recognize that if this policy question makes sense, it will only make sense in a relatively narrowly defined category. Now, even there, there's at least two competing forces, right? So on the one hand, on the positive side, allowing the platform to actively participate on its marketplace and compete with the third-party sellers actually creates competition. So that's actually good for consumers because it does allow them the choice, as opposed to, say, allowing a third-party seller to be the dominant player. On the other hand, and this I think gets to the heart of the policymakers' concern, is that obviously because the platform owns the marketplace, you might worry that they may distort competition. So this can take at least two important forms. They can use proprietary data that they observe from third-party sellers to inform its own product design and introduction decisions. And of course, in turn, that may reduce third-party innovation incentives if they know they're going to be held up by the platform. And then second, the platform also obviously controls the recommendation algorithm and what buyers or consumers see. So of course, the platform can heavily influence consumers or steer them in favor of its own products to the detriment of third parties. So yes, these are practices that we should obviously be concerned about. So let me just briefly tell you what we find in the economic analysis. So what we do is we simply model a platform that can choose one of three modes. It can be a pure marketplace, a pure reseller, or it can choose this hybrid or dual mode. And what we find, perhaps not surprisingly, is that from the platform's perspective, the dual mode is the most profitable unless the product that it offers, competing with the third parties, has a very large advantage, in which case obviously it prefers to be a reseller. But the idea for why the platform prefers the dual mode is pretty simple. It combines the transaction benefits of having all the transactions conducted on the platform with the third-party innovations. Obviously, the platform does internalize the fact that third parties can innovate and would rather have those third parties offer those innovations on its marketplace because that benefits its consumers. However, and at the same time, what the platform does by introducing its own product is that it can constrain the pricing of the innovative third parties and therefore offer more surplus to consumers, which in turn brings more consumers to the platform as a whole. In this context, what we look at is, well, what happens if policymakers ban the dual mode, so prevent the platform from functioning in dual mode? So in general, what we find is that the ban benefits third-party sellers, not surprisingly, because it deprives them of competition, but typically results in lower consumer surplus and total welfare. And I think it's useful to emphasize here that we find this result, and this still holds, even when we allow for endogenous innovation. So, third parties endogenously innovate, so we take into account the innovation incentives of the third parties, and we allow the platform to either imitate or self-preference its own product. So it is actually a pretty strong result. And in turn, so what we look at is alternative policy measures to deal with these issues. And we find that these behavioral policy options, which essentially are focused on banning steering, so the platform steering consumers to its own product, and imitation of innovative third-party products, we find that these targeted policy options always do better than the blanket ban on the dual mode. And let me finish in the last couple of slides. I just want to talk a little bit about practical considerations. So one of the concerns that people might raise, and I guess justifiably so, about these behavioral remedies, which we argue are much better than the structural remedy of banning the dual mode, is that they may be more difficult to implement. So let me talk in turn about both of them. So the first one says, well, we should try to, in some shape or form, ban imitation by the platform of the innovative third-party products. Actually, what we mean, so we have to be clear here, imitation by itself is not forbidden, and it's basically another word for it is competition. So we certainly don't want to ban that. I think the real concern here to get at is that in imitating and competing with third parties, the platform is leveraging proprietary data that is not available to anyone else. So the key concern here is that what can we do to sort of prevent the platform from leveraging and utilizing this kind of proprietary data? So one option would be to require platforms to implement an internal Chinese wall, which basically separates the marketplace division, so the one that actually runs the marketplace and possibly observes or has access to the data of third parties, from the product or reseller division, which is the one that actually comes up with and produces the products. So there's a good example here, which is Amazon. So Amazon's been accused of doing this. And in fact, I think the Wall Street Journal last year had a piece in which basically they found out that even though Amazon actually does have, interestingly enough, they do have an internal policy that prevents the product teams from going and taking proprietary information from the marketplace team. Some, I guess, entrepreneurial people inside the product team found a way around this restriction and went and actually used that data to inform their own product decisions. So yes, this is definitely something we should go after, but I think it's certainly possible to implement this legislation that basically requires a Chinese wall and then punish the platforms that violate it accordingly. The other one, so the other behavioral policy measure is to ban self-preferencing by the platform. So this would seem more difficult, right? Because self-preferencing most of the time takes the form of the platform using its algorithm, which basically no one has the formula for, to steer consumers towards its own products. So you might say, well, how exactly are we going to force the platform to not steer, given that they control the algorithm? And I mean, it seems crazy. It would seem pretty extreme to force them to reveal the algorithm. Well, this is not our idea, by the way. I've seen this proposed by other people, and I think it's perfectly reasonable. One possibility would be to allow outside auditing of what the algorithm does. So this could take the form of requiring the platform to provide public APIs, which could be used by researchers or policymakers, so approved outsiders, to audit its recommendation algorithm and figure out what it does. Does it, for example, does it truly offer consumers, does it recommend consumers the cheaper, the cheaper/better product, or does it unduly preference the platform's own products? So I certainly think something like that would be implementable. And I think I'm on time, so I will stop here. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to the questions. Let me unshare my screen.
Thanks, Andrei. You actually started to work on platforms where there wasn't, where we're also thinking a little bit about offline platforms. Remember the shopping malls and some of the big retailers. And there's a question by Patrick Ray. I think that question has been asked also in some other events I have been participating in. So are we just rediscovering something which existed essentially in the same way, where we have, for example, say large retailers who also do this imitation strategy by introducing private labels when they see that a different product succeeds? So I guess the question is there anything fundamentally different in this online world compared to the old offline world, where, say, Walmart was playing a very prominent role in US retailing?
Sure. So I mean, yes, I think it's always a very good question to think about, right? To be clear, to draw parallels. So I think there's a lot of stuff so there are a lot of things that are similar. Maybe there's perhaps a couple key differences now, because the more interesting question is, do those differences warrant like different treatment or different implications? So to me, like the most important difference is the following. So in the case of a retailer, what's the difference between a retailer and a platform? Well, the retailer always controls how the products are sold to consumers. So how all the products are sold to consumers, the third parties and its own products. In the case of a platform, the difference is if a platform, so on a marketplace, the platform doesn't really fully control how the third parties are priced, or I guess how they're marketed to consumers. So in some sense, the retailer already has a lot more control over all the products, versus in the case of a marketplace, the whole point is that the marketplace only enables the third parties to interact. So I guess the question is then, the more interesting question is like, do we have to worry more about about the platforms competing, so creating private labels in a platform context versus a retail context? I guess some people would make the argument, well, in the platform context, there's more. So the other aspect is like there's more concentration. I guess there's more dominance in some sense by by a company like Amazon, just because its platform is more scalable, so it has a lot more power. I mean, I think to me that's a difference in degree. I'm not sure it necessarily warrants like a fundamentally different treatment. So the other part again that has to do with this difference in control over the relationship with consumers. I think this goes back to the issue of steering. So in the case, I guess in the case of a retailer, the retailer already has full power, like how they display the product, you know, who gets shown, who doesn't. In the case of a marketplace, there's this sort of like expectation that it's a more like level playing field, perhaps, and that's why, in some sense, like people just get more. I don't know, there's maybe because of this expectation that like people feel like it's more unfair that someone like Amazon steers consumers towards its own products versus like say showing, you know, all the possible options.
Possibly another difference might be that at least in some of these online environments, we talk about huge imbalances in terms of size. So you have sometimes very small sellers or possibly also manufacturers, whereas a platform, in some instances at least, has a very different scale. To a certain extent, that was perhaps mirrored also in the Walmart world, but even there you do see quite a number of sellers with a very different size than some of those who are operating, say, on Amazon Marketplace. So I guess that might as well be something why, at least at the policy arena, there's more concern about this.
So I agree. This is actually what I mentioned, right? So there's this sense that with platforms, I guess we can tie this back to the fact that platforms are more scalable and therefore they can gain more market power. So you're right, this power imbalance appears. But I would caution. So I know this is like a favorite thing with policymakers to say, oh, look how Amazon is crushing these like very small mom and pop like sellers. But I would turn it around and say, well, actually, it's precisely because we have online platforms that we've seen a proliferation of these very small sellers, which previously the only options they had was to go to Walmart. Well, a lot of them could not afford this. So, you know, I think this is absolutely true. A lot of these large e-commerce platforms are certainly responsible for enabling a lot more merchants, like small merchants, to thrive, to appear and to thrive. So, I mean, I think any analysis that basically tries to argue that somehow like these large platforms online are crushing the small party sellers should actually you need to take a step back and say, well, to some degree, they're also enabling a lot more of them. But yeah, maybe on the margin, you know, I'm sure, like, again, I'm sure all of them have some unfair practices, and this is why I think you should go after the unfair practices. But I think sort of to a large extent, they're also enabling a lot of the innovation by the third parties. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Thanks, Andrei.